The whole camp stopped because one old man looked at an enemy soldier and saw his son. Iowa, January 1945. Frost clung to the barbed wire like powdered glass, and the cornfields beyond the fence lay flat and colorless under a low winter sky. The prisoner of war camp sat 3 miles outside a town small enough that everyone knew when the milk truck was late and when a new soldier arrived by bus. That morning, the new soldier was Private Thomas Miller, 19 years old, from a farm near Cedar Rapids, with a rifle too long for his narrow shoulders and a face still too young to hide what he felt. He had been told not to smile. He had been told not to talk unless necessary. He had been told that German prisoners were disciplined men who watched for weakness the way wolves watched for an open gate. So Tommy stood straight beside the roll call yard, boots sinking slightly into the frozen mud, breath rising white in front of his mouth. Across from him, 200 German prisoners stood in gray coats marked with PW, their hands bare, their cheeks hollow from years that had taken more than food from them. Some were young. Some were old enough to be his father. They moved when ordered. They stopped when ordered. They looked at the ground because looking too long at a guard could be mistaken for defiance. Sergeant James Whitaker walked the line with a clipboard tucked under one arm. He was 38, square-jawed, and tired in the permanent way of men who had spent too many mornings enforcing rules they did not write. "Keep your eyes open, Miller," he said without turning his head. "They're prisoners, not neighbors." Tommy nodded. "Yes, Sergeant." The names began. One by one, prisoners answered in accented voices, each name turning into a number, each number checked with a pencil mark. Then the line reached Karl Weiss. Prisoner 4182, 46 years old, former watchmaker from Bremen, captured in France, transferred twice, quiet in barracks, no disciplinary record. He stepped forward when called, but he did not answer at once. His eyes had found Tommy. Not the rifle, not the uniform, the face, the pale winter skin, the soft brown hair under the helmet, the uncertain mouth trying to look firm. Karl stared as if the cold had reached inside his chest and stopped something there. Whitaker looked up. "Answer when called." Karl blinked. His right hand moved toward his coat pocket, not quickly, not secretly, but with the slow habit of a man reaching for memory. Tommy's fingers tightened on the rifle. The yard seemed to grow quieter. A crow lifted from the roof of the mess hall and beat its wings toward the bare trees. Whitaker stepped closer. "Hands where I can see them." Karl obeyed. Something slipped from his pocket and fell into the mud at his feet. A small silver pocket watch. The glass was cracked. The chain was dark with age. It landed face up, its hands frozen at 6:17. Tommy saw Karl look down at it with a pain so controlled it almost looked like discipline. The old man did not bend for it. He only stood there, shoulders held straight, lips pressed thin, as if the watch had fallen from a place deeper than his pocket. Whitaker frowned and pointed with his pencil. "Miller, pick that up." Tommy stepped forward, aware of every eye on him. The mud sucked softly at his boots. He crouched, lifted the watch, and wiped the edge of it with his glove. It felt colder than metal should feel. When he handed it back, Karl did not take it immediately. He looked at Tommy's hand, then at Tommy's face. For a moment, the fences, the towers, the gray coats, and the rifle seemed to disappear into the breath between them. Karl took the watch with both hands. His voice came out low, careful, shaped by a language that had once belonged to another life. "My son would be your age." No one moved. Not Whitaker. Not the prisoners. Not Tommy Miller, who suddenly felt 19 in a way he had been trying all morning not to feel. Karl lowered his eyes to the broken watch. He did not ask for mercy. He did not explain himself. He simply stepped back into line, holding the stop time of another boy in his palm. After roll call, the camp returned to its ordinary sounds, but ordinary no longer felt ordinary to Tommy Miller. Boots scraped across frozen ground. A mess bell rang from somewhere beyond the yard. A truck engine coughed near the supply shed, then settled into a low idle. Men moved in lines because the camp had taught them to move in lines. Guards checked gates because the camp had taught them to check gates. Smoke rose from the kitchen chimney in a thin gray ribbon, and beyond the fence, the Iowa fields waited under snow crust as if nothing important had happened there. Tommy stood at his post with his gloves stiff around the rifle stock, trying not to look toward the prisoner barracks. He had wanted this assignment to make him feel older. He had wanted the uniform to do what his birthday had not done. Back home, everyone still remembered him carrying milk pails too heavy for his arms, chasing chickens behind his mother's garden, falling asleep in the hayloft when he was supposed to be helping his father repair a wagon wheel. Even at the bus station in Cedar Rapids, his mother had held his face in both hands before he left, as if he were still 12 years old and running a fever. She had not cried. That was worse. She had only studied him carefully, memorizing him in silence, then straightened his collar with fingers that trembled once and stopped. His father had shaken his hand, firm and brief, and told him to do his duty. Tommy had carried those words all the way through training. Do your duty. Stand straight. Listen first. Do not shame the family name. But duty had looked simpler in the manual. A man was either a guard or a prisoner. A rule was either followed or broken. A gate was either locked or open. No page in the manual had explained what to do when an enemy said one sentence and made the uniform feel suddenly too large. Sergeant Whitaker noticed the change before noon. He noticed everything. He had the kind of eyes that could count missing shovels from 20 yards away and hear hesitation inside a simple yes, Sergeant. When the work detail formed near the tool shed, Whitaker stopped beside Tommy and spoke without raising his voice. You are thinking too much. Tommy kept his gaze forward. No, Sergeant. That means yes. Whitaker looked across the yard where Karl Weiss stood with 6 other prisoners waiting to be assigned to maintenance work. Karl held his cap in both hands. His face had gone still again, closed like a shop after business hours. That man got under your skin. Tommy swallowed. The air tasted like coal smoke and cold iron. He just said something. That is how men get under your skin. They say something. Whitaker shifted the clipboard under his arm. You are not here to understand them. You are here to keep order. Tommy nodded because nodding was safer than answering. The sergeant stepped closer, his voice lower now, not cruel, almost tired. Listen to me, Miller. Most of them are polite. Some are educated. Some speak better English than men I grew up with. That does not change the fence. Do not confuse manners with innocence. Do not confuse sadness with harmlessness. And do not let one old man turn your head because you remind him of somebody. Tommy looked at the snow packed between his boots. Yes, Sergeant. Whitaker held him there a moment longer, then moved on. The work detail passed through the inner gate. Karl walked in the middle of the line, neither slow nor fast. As he passed Tommy, he did not look up. That made it worse. If Karl had stared again, Tommy could have called it manipulation. If Karl had spoken, Tommy could have reported it. But the man only walked by with the quiet obedience of someone who had already spent all his words. In the afternoon, Tommy was posted near the repair shed, a low wooden building that smelled of oil, wet wool, sawdust, and old rope. Prisoners fixed broken crates there, sharpened farm tools, patched hinges, and repaired the small damages that winter made worse. Karl sat at the far bench with a box of damaged camp clocks in front of him. Tommy had not known prisoners were allowed to do work like that. He watched Karl remove the back of a wall clock with a careful twist of the wrist, lay each tiny screw in a straight line, then bend over the mechanism as if listening to something too faint for anyone else to hear. His hands were not the hands Tommy expected. They were broad at the knuckles, roughened by cold, but delicate in motion. They moved with patience. They did not waste anything. After several minutes, one of the clocks began to tick. The sound was small, almost shy, but every man in the shed heard it. Karl set it aside and reached for another. Tommy looked away quickly, angry with himself for watching. He was supposed to see prisoners. Numbers. Coats. Work assignments. Not a father with a broken watch. Not a craftsman coaxing time back into a room where time had become the enemy. Outside, the winter light faded early. By 4 o'clock, the camp lamps were already glowing yellow above the yard, and the snow beyond the fence had turned blue in the shadows. Tommy stood under one of those lamps and rubbed warmth back into his fingers. In his coat pocket was a letter from his mother he had not opened yet. He knew what it would say. The hens had slowed laying. His father had strained his back. Mrs. Donnelly from church had sent preserves. Everyone was proud. Everyone prayed. Ordinary things. Safe things. Things a boy should have been glad to read. But all he could think about was the stopped watch in Karl Weiss's palm, and a son somewhere across an ocean who would never stand in an Iowa yard under a yellow camp lamp, trying to look older than he was. That night, The wind came down from the north and moved through the camp in long, steady breaths, pressing against the barracks walls, rattling loose panes of glass, making the telephone wires hum like low strings. Tommy sat on the edge of his bunk in the guard's quarters with his mother's letter open on his knees. The paper smelled faintly of home, not because it carried any real scent after the miles it had traveled, but because his mind put one there. Laundry soap, wood smoke, the flour dust that always clung to his mother's apron on baking days. She wrote about the farm in small, careful lines. The pump had frozen twice. His father had traded 2 sacks of cornmeal for a repaired harness. His younger sister Ruth had won a spelling contest at school and insisted the prize ribbon be hung over the kitchen stove where everyone could see it. At the bottom, his mother had added one sentence that made Tommy stop reading. "You still look so young in the photograph you sent, but I suppose every mother thinks that." He folded the letter slowly and slid it back into the envelope. Across the room, too, other guards played cards on an overturned crate. Someone laughed at something small. A stove clicked and settled. Ordinary sounds again. Tommy lay back without taking off his boots and stared at the ceiling beams. He tried to picture Karl Weiss as the army file described him. Prisoner 4182. German. Male. 46. Skilled labor. Watch repair. No incidents. But the file did not show Bremen before the war. It did not show a narrow shop with a green door and brass letters painted on the window. Weiss Uhren und Reparateuren. Weiss Clocks and Repairs. It did not show Karl standing behind the counter with a magnifying lens fixed in one eye, listening to the secret heartbeat of watches brought in by clerks, sailors, school teachers, and women who wanted a grandfather clock to keep better time before Christmas. It did not show his son Matthias sitting at a small workbench after school, feet not yet touching the floor, taking apart broken alarm clocks only to put them together with 2 screws left over and an embarrassed smile. Karl had taught the boy to begin with patience. Never force a gear. Never blame the spring until you have checked the dust. Never assume a thing is useless because it has stopped. Those were shop lessons. Later, they became life lessons. Matthias grew tall in the awkward way boys did, all wrists and knees before strength arrived. He had his mother's fair hair and Karl's habit of looking down when he was thinking. He liked American jazz records, though he played them softly because the neighbors complained. He liked bicycles. He hated marching drills at school. When men in uniform spoke on the radio, Matthias left the room and pretended he needed to fetch coal. On his 17th birthday, Karl gave him the silver pocket watch. It was not new. It had belonged to Karl's father, and before that to a railroad man who had once sworn it kept better time than the station clock. Karl had polished the case until it caught the lamplight. Inside the lid, he had engraved one word: Matthias. The boy had run his thumb across the letters and said nothing for a long time. Then he had put the watch in his vest pocket and stood a little straighter, not because the gift made him a man, but because his father had trusted him with time. That was the memory Karl carried into every camp, through every transfer, across every cold morning when names were called and men answered like numbers. The watch had stopped months before Iowa. He knew exactly how to fix it. A bent balance staff. A cracked jewel. Maybe both. He had repaired harder things with worse tools. But he had never opened it. Not once. To repair the watch would mean admitting it was only a machine. To let it remain stopped allowed him to believe, in a private corner of his mind no officer could inspect, that time itself had paused at 6:17 and was waiting for his boy to come home. In the prisoner barracks, Karl sat on the lower bunk beneath a thin army blanket, the watch cupped in his hand. Around him, men slept or pretended to sleep. He could hear breathing, boards creaking, the far call of a guard changing posts. He opened the lid and looked at the engraved name. Matthias. His lips moved without sound. Outside, under the yellow camp lights, Tommy Miller walked his midnight round with his collar turned up against the cold, not knowing that 50 yards away, an enemy prisoner was holding a father's whole world in one palm and trying not to let memory make a sound. By morning, the cold had sharpened. The yard was white with hard frost, and every footstep made a dry crunch that carried farther than it should. Tommy came off the midnight round with red eyes and stiff fingers, but there was no time to sleep. Captain Robert Hayes had ordered a routine inspection of the prisoner barracks after a missing screwdriver had not been returned from the repair shed. No one accused anyone directly. That was not how the camp worked. The captain believed in procedure the way some men believed in weather signs. Follow procedure, and trouble stayed small. Ignore procedure, and trouble found a crack. The prisoners were lined outside while the guards moved through the barracks, lifting mattresses, opening footlockers, checking coat seams, counting spoons, pencils, buttons, tools, anything that could be misplaced, hidden, or misunderstood. Tommy stood near the doorway while Sergeant Whitaker searched the lower bunks. The air inside smelled of damp wool, stove ash, boot leather, and men trying to keep warm without complaint. It was not a pleasant smell, but it was human. That bothered Tommy more than he wanted it to. At Karl Weiss's bunk, Whitaker paused. The footlocker was neat. One folded shirt. One pair of socks darned twice at the heel. A small German Bible with a cracked spine. 3 letters tied with string. A pencil worn almost to nothing. Then the watch. Whitaker lifted it by the chain and held it toward the window light. The silver case looked dull in the gray morning. Mud still marked one edge from the yard. This again, he said. Tommy felt his stomach tighten. Karl stood outside with the others, visible through the frosted glass, his cap held against his chest. He could not hear them, but he was watching. Whitaker opened the lid. His eyes moved over the stopped hands, the cracked glass, the engraved name inside. Could hide something in a case like this, he said. Paper, code, thin blade, anything small enough. Tommy kept his voice level. It was already checked at intake. Sergeant, things get missed. Whitaker turned the watch over. And men get clever when they are bored. He carried it outside into the yard. The prisoners stood in formation, breath rising around them. Karl's eyes went to the watch immediately. He did not step forward. He did not ask for it. But his whole face changed in a way Tommy wished he had not seen. Whitaker stopped in front of him. This item is being held until the captain decides whether you may keep it. Karl listened to the words, then glanced at Tommy as though checking whether he had understood correctly. It is mine, Karl said. Not the question. It is not useful for escape. Whitaker's jaw tightened. That is not your decision. Karl nodded once, but his hand opened and closed at his side. A small movement. Barely anything. Tommy saw it. Captain Hayes came across the yard with his overcoat buttoned high and his gloves tucked under one arm. He had the calm walk of a man who disliked scenes and expected others to dislike them as well. Whitaker handed him the watch and explained the inspection. Hayes listened, opened the case, looked at the frozen hands, then at Karl. Why have you not had this repaired? You work on clocks every day. The question passed through the interpreter, but Karl understood enough before the German words arrived. He looked at the ground for a moment. When he answered, his English was slow. Because if I repair it, then it is only a watch. The interpreter hesitated, then repeated the sentence more softly in English, though no one needed him to. The yard went quiet in that peculiar way men became quiet when something private had stepped into public view. Hayes studied Karl. Whitaker looked away. Tommy watched the watch in the captain's hand, its silver case catching a pale strip of winter sun. A machine could be searched. A machine could be tagged. A machine could be locked in a property box. But this was not only a machine. Not anymore. Hayes closed the lid and held it out. You may keep it, he said. It remains subject to inspection. You will not take it outside the barracks without permission. Karl accepted it with both hands. Thank you, Captain. Hayes gave a short nod and moved on, already returning to the safety of procedure. Whitaker followed him toward the next line of bunks, but before he passed Tommy, he murmured, "Do not make that face, Miller." Tommy looked straight ahead. What face, Sergeant? The face of a boy who thinks he just witnessed justice. Whitaker stepped closer, voice low enough that only Tommy heard. That was Mercy wearing a regulation coat. Learn the difference. Tommy said nothing. Across the yard, Karl slipped the watch back into his pocket, careful as a man placing a sleeping child under a blanket. For the first time since arriving at the camp, Tommy understood that some things were not dangerous because they could help a man escape. Some things were dangerous because they reminded everyone that the fence had not erased who a man had been before he stood behind it. By the end of that week, the camp had learned to move around the watch as if it were something alive. No one said this openly. Men did not say such things in places built from rules, fences, and posted orders. But they noticed. A prisoner passing Karl in the washroom would glance once at his coat pocket, then look away. A guard counting tools in the repair shed would pause a fraction longer when Karl reached for a screwdriver, not because he feared the old man, but because he had seen the way the watch had changed the air in the yard. Even Sergeant Whitaker stopped mentioning it. That, for Whitaker, was nearly kindness. The repair shed became Karl's quiet territory. Each afternoon, after mess, he sat beneath the same dusty window where winter light fell across the bench in a pale rectangle. Broken clocks came to him in cardboard boxes. Alarm clocks from the officers' quarters. A kitchen timer from the mess hall. A wall clock from the infirmary that lost 7 minutes every hour. Karl repaired them without complaint. He worked with the stillness of a man who knew that small things mattered most when large things had failed. Tommy watched from the door more often than he should have. He told himself he was posted there. He told himself prisoners with tools needed watching. Both were true. Neither was the whole truth. One afternoon, a farm truck came through the outer gate carrying sacks of potatoes, 2 cracked milk cans, and a radio from Captain Hayes's office that had stopped working during a weather report. The driver, an older man in a wool cap, joked with the guards while stamping his boots clean. Snow had begun falling again, thin and dry, the kind of snow that looked harmless until it covered every track. Hayes wanted the radio fixed before evening because Washington news came through at 6 o'clock, and officers disliked silence when the world was moving faster than they could follow. Whitaker set the radio on Karl's bench. "You work on these?" Karl looked at the wooden case, then at the dial. Some means yes or no. It means I will try." Whitaker almost smiled. Almost. He pointed at Tommy. "Miller, you stay here until it is done. No loose parts leave this bench." Tommy stepped inside and closed the door against the cold. The shed felt warmer than the yard, though not warm enough to soften the air. Karl removed the back panel of the radio. Dust lay inside like gray flour. Tommy stood 6 feet away, hands behind his back, watching copper wires and small glass tubes appear beneath Karl's fingers. For several minutes, there was only the sound of the stove ticking, snow tapping against the window, and Karl's tools making careful contact with metal. "Your mother writes to you," Karl said without looking up. Tommy stiffened. "How do you know that?" "You carry the envelope in the same pocket. You touch it when you are cold." Tommy glanced down before he could stop himself. The letter was there, folded along the crease his mother had made. "That does not mean anything." "No," Karl said. "It means much." The words were not intrusive. They landed softly, like snow on the roof. Tommy looked toward the window. Outside, prisoners moved between barracks with collars turned up, gray shapes in a white afternoon. "She worries," Tommy said after a while. "Mothers do," Karl answered. He adjusted a wire with the point of a small tool. "Fathers also. But fathers hide it worse." Tommy almost laughed, but the sound did not come out. Karl lifted one of the glass tubes and held it to the light. When Matthias was small, he hated thunder. Bremen storms came from the harbor. Big sound. Windows shaking. He would sit under my workbench and pretend he was helping me look for screws. Karl set the tube down. He thought I did not know he was afraid. "Did you tell him you knew?" "No. I dropped screws on purpose." Tommy looked at him then. Karl's face had not changed. No smile. No performance. Just the memory of a father making small kindness look like accident so a boy could keep his pride. The radio gave a sudden crackle. Then a low hum filled the shed. Karl turned the dial slowly. Static. A burst of music. Static again. Then a man's voice, distant and formal, speaking about winter roads, troop movements, ration notices, names of places Tommy had only seen printed on maps. Whitaker opened the door just as the sound cleared. "Well, I will be," he muttered. Karl replaced the back panel and pushed the radio gently toward him. "Loose connection," he said. "Dust also." Whitaker checked the bench, counted the tools, and carried the radio out. Tommy remained by the door. Karl began placing each screwdriver back in its outline on the board. "Why did you tell me that story?" Tommy asked. Karl did not turn. "Because you looked like a boy trying not to be afraid of thunder." The words should have angered him. From another man, they would have. From Karl, they only made the room feel smaller and warmer. Tommy touched the envelope in his coat pocket. He thought of his mother's careful handwriting, his father's brief handshake, Ruth's prize ribbon hanging above the stove. He thought of Matthias under a workbench in Bremen, pretending to search for screws while thunder moved over the harbor. Outside, the 6 o'clock bell rang through the falling snow. Tommy opened the shed door and let in a blade of cold air. Karl stood and reached for his cap. For the first time, Tommy did not see a prisoner leaving a workbench. He saw a man stepping away from the only kind of fatherhood the war had left him. The next morning brought a thaw that made the whole camp look tired. Snow slid from the barracks roofs in wet sheets. Mud returned to the yard. The fence posts sweated dark streaks where frost had melted, and the road beyond the gate turned soft under the wheels of supply trucks. Tommy had slept only 3 hours, but the sound of the repaired radio had followed him into his dreams, a low hum beneath everything, as if Karl Weiss had not fixed a machine but opened a door. At breakfast, the guards ate powdered eggs, toast, and coffee strong enough to taste burned. Whitaker read a newspaper near the stove, his lips moving slightly over the headlines. Another guard complained about wet socks. Someone asked whether the Hawkeyes would ever have a decent season again. Tommy tried to listen. He tried to sit like the others, shoulders loose, face blank, fork moving from plate to mouth without thought. Then Captain Hayes appeared in the doorway holding a pale yellow envelope. He looked around once and found Tommy. "Miller," he said. "Office." The room quieted in the small way rooms quieted when a man was called by rank and last name before coffee was finished. Tommy wiped his mouth with a napkin and stood. The hallway to the office smelled of floor wax and damp wool. Hayes did not speak until the door closed behind them. On the desk lay Tommy's personnel file, a blotter, a black telephone, and the envelope. Western Union. Tommy knew the color before he understood the shape. His mother had once said telegrams made every kitchen in America hold its breath. Hayes pushed it toward him gently. This came through County Dispatch. Tommy looked at his name typed across the front. Private Thomas Edward Miller. Camp 14, Iowa. The letters seemed too neat for the thing they carried. "Is it my father?" Hayes shook his head. "No. It concerns your cousin, Daniel Miller. Your aunt asked that you be informed. Daniel, 22, from Des Moines." The cousin who had taught Tommy to throw a baseball straight, who could whistle through his teeth, who had sent one postcard from England with nothing written on it, but the weather is terrible and the tea is worse. Tommy opened the envelope. The words were formal. Regret. Notification. Hospital. Overseas. Stable condition. Further information pending. No pictures. No explanation a mind could hold. Just the official language of distance. Tommy read it once. Then again. He waited for feeling to arrive in a shape he recognized. It did not. What came instead was heat behind his eyes and a hard, clean anger that needed somewhere to stand. Hayes watched him without interruption. "He is alive," the captain said quietly. Tommy nodded. His mouth felt dry. "Yes, sir. Take a few minutes before you return to duty. I can work." That was not a request. Tommy stepped outside into the wet morning. The yard was full of motion. Prisoners carried laundry baskets. A guard checked a gate latch. Steam rose from the kitchen roof. Everything continued. That seemed almost insulting. By noon, Tommy was posted again at the repair shed. He had asked for no favor and received none, except that Whitaker spoke to him less. Inside, Karl sat at the bench repairing the infirmary clock, turning a tiny screw between finger and thumb. The sight of him there, calm and patient, made something in Tommy tighten. A German man fixing an American clock while Daniel lay in a hospital across the ocean. A father speaking of sons while other families waited by telephones. A prisoner holding grief as if grief made him different from anyone else. Tommy hated the thought as soon as it formed, but he could not stop it. Karl looked up. "You are troubled." Tommy's voice came out sharper than he meant. "Do your work." Karl lowered his eyes at once. "Yes." The clock ticked. Too loud. Tommy looked at the window, at the mud, at his own reflection faint in the glass. He saw a boy in a helmet trying to look like judgment. Minutes passed. Karl did not speak again. That silence worked on Tommy more than any argument could have. It gave him room to hear himself. To hear the unfairness of blaming one old man for a world that had taken boys from both sides and sent their names home in envelopes. When the clock began running, Karl set it upright and slid it across the bench. Tommy picked it up. "My cousin is in a hospital overseas," he said. The word surprised him. Karl's hands became still. "I am sorry." Tommy wanted to reject the sorrow. He wanted to say Karl had no right to it. But the old man's face held no defense, no excuse, no claim of equal suffering. Only recognition. The kind a father might offer another family from the far side of a fence. Tommy looked down at the clock in his hands. The second hand moved steadily, indifferent and faithful. Karl reached into his coat and took out a small folded scrap of paper. He did not hand it to Tommy. He placed it on the bench between them. When bad news comes, Karl said, a man must not become the bad news. Tommy stared at the paper. There was nothing written on the outside. The shed smelled of oil, wet wood, and thawing earth. Outside, water dripped from the roof in slow, measured beats. Tommy did not pick up the paper yet, but he did not walk away. Tommy left the folded scrap of paper on the bench until the end of the work period. He told himself it was not his. He told himself a guard should not take notes from a prisoner, even harmless ones, even ones placed in the open where any man could see them. But when Whitaker called the final tool count, and the prisoners lined up to return to barracks, the paper was still there, small and white against the scarred wood. Karl did not look at it. He put away his tools, buttoned his coat, and stepped into line with the others. That was his way of leaving the choice untouched. Tommy waited until the door had closed behind the last prisoner. Then he picked up the paper. The words were written in careful English, the letters too formal in places, as if copied from a schoolbook. A father knows that silence. Nothing else. No signature. No apology. No explanation. Tommy folded it once and put it in his shirt pocket, behind the Western Union telegram. The two pieces of paper rested against each other through the afternoon, one carrying fear from his own family, the other carrying understanding from a man he was supposed to keep at a distance. By evening, rain began to fall over the camp. Not snow now. Rain. Cold, steady, and gray, turning the yard into black mud and making the roofs drip without pause. The prisoners returned from mess under raised collars. Guards stood under the eaves and stamped their boots clean. The whole place smelled of wet wool, coal smoke, and thawing earth. At 7 o'clock, the main furnace serving the North Barracks failed. At first, no one understood it as a serious thing. A pipe knocked twice. Steam hissed and stopped. Then the radiators inside the prisoner barracks cooled from hot to warm to dead iron. Within an hour, the old men began wrapping blankets around their shoulders. The younger ones tried to make jokes in German, but their breath showed white inside the room. Captain Hayes sent for the county mechanic, but the telephone line to town crackled uselessly in the rain. The road had gone soft. The mechanic might not arrive until morning. Whitaker cursed the weather under his breath and ordered extra blankets brought from storage. It was the proper response. It was also not enough. Tommy stood in the doorway of the North Barracks with a lantern in his hand, watching prisoners sit close together along the bunks. No panic. No shouting. Just waiting. Men in camps became good at waiting. That was what made it worse. Karl Weiss stood near the cold radiator at the far wall, one hand resting lightly on the pipe, head tilted. Listening. Tommy recognized the expression from the repair shed. The old man was not merely touching metal. He was hearing a machine through his fingers. Karl looked up. Valve is stuck, he said. Whitaker turned. You know that from standing there? From listening. Convenient. Karl removed his hand from the pipe. Old buildings speak. This pipe is not moving steam. Pressure is wrong before the turn. Whitaker looked toward the utility door at the end of the corridor. Behind it was the service passage leading to the furnace room. Prisoners were not permitted there. No exceptions without written authorization. Everyone knew it. Tommy knew it. Hayes knew it when he arrived 5 minutes later, hat wet from the rain, face set with the patience of a man being pressed by circumstances he had not invited. Karl repeated the explanation through the interpreter. A stuck pressure valve. A sediment blockage. Maybe a coupling that had slipped. He had worked with heating systems in Bremen because clock shops in old buildings froze like every other shop if the pipes failed. Hayes listened, eyes moving from Karl to the shivering men to the locked utility door. Whitaker said, Sir, regulations are clear. Hayes answered, I am aware of the regulations. The rain tapped hard against the windows. Somewhere in the barracks, an older prisoner coughed into a blanket, then lowered his head with embarrassment. Tommy felt the telegram in his pocket. He felt Karl's note behind it. A father knows that silence. He stepped forward before he could make himself stop. Sir, he said. Hayes looked at him. Private. Tommy's throat tightened, but his voice held. Let him try. I will escort him. Sergeant Whitaker can stand at the door. We can keep the tool count ourselves. Whitaker stared at him as if the boy had just crossed a line he could not uncross. Hayes did not speak for several seconds. The camp seemed to hold its breath, not dramatically, not loudly, but in the tired way cold rooms do when warmth depends on a small decision. Finally, Hayes took the key ring from his coat pocket. 5 minutes, he said. 1 tool bag. The door stays open. Miller, he is your responsibility. Tommy accepted the keys. They were heavier than he expected. Karl followed him into the service passage without triumph, without a glance at the other prisoners, without any sign that permission had become victory. The passage smelled of damp brick and old heat. The furnace room glowed dull orange around the seams of the firebox. Pipes ran along the ceiling like black branches. Karl listened once, then pointed to a valve near the elbow joint. There, he said. Tommy held the lantern higher. Karl worked quickly, but not hurriedly. A wrench. A cloth. 2 careful turns. A pause. Another turn. Then the pipe shuddered. Steam moved. Not loudly. Not like a miracle. Just a low rushing sound. Practical and plain. Traveling through iron toward the rooms where men waited under blankets. Tommy looked at Karl's face in the lantern light. There was no pride there. Only relief. When they returned to the barracks, the first radiator had begun to tick. Then another. Then another. Heat entered the room in small metal beats. No one cheered. No one applauded. An old prisoner closed his eyes and rested both hands on the warming pipe. Whitaker counted the tools twice. Hayes locked the utility door. The regulations settled back into place, but not exactly as before. Tommy stood beside Karl while rain moved down the glass in narrow lines. For the first time, he understood that courage did not always announce itself. Sometimes it sounded like steam returning through a cold pipe because someone had opened a door 5 minutes before morning would have been too late. The furnace incident did not disappear with the morning. Camps remembered rule breaking longer than they remembered cold rooms, and by daylight every man on both sides of the fence knew that Karl Weiss had been taken into a service passage where prisoners were not supposed to go. The North Barracks were warm again. That was the fact no report could avoid. The radiators clicked and sighed through breakfast. Steam moved through the pipes with the modest confidence of something repaired correctly. Men held their tin cups close to the heat before drinking. A few older prisoners slept past the first bell, not from defiance, but from the deep exhaustion that comes after a night spent bracing against cold. Captain Hayes inspected the furnace room himself at 8 o'clock, with Sergeant Whitaker beside him and Tommy standing 3 paces behind. The valve had been cleaned. The pressure had returned. No tools were missing. Nothing had been damaged. Everything about the outcome was practical, successful, and inconvenient. Hayes stood under the pipes and looked at the repair as if it had insulted him by being necessary. "This will go in the log," he said. Whitaker nodded. "Yes, sir." The prisoner entered a restricted service area under escort. "Yes, sir." The prisoner corrected a mechanical failure that could have become a medical problem. Whitaker was quiet for half a second. "Yes, sir." Hayes turned to Tommy. "You understood the regulation when you spoke up." Tommy kept his hands at his sides. "Yes, sir." "And you understood what might happen if something went wrong." "Yes, sir." "Did you make that suggestion because of sympathy?" The words sounded colder than accusation. Tommy looked at the furnace door, at the black pipe Karl had touched, at the place where steam had returned because someone had trusted skill over suspicion for 5 minutes. "No, sir," he said. Hayes watched him. "Then why?" Tommy answered slowly, choosing words that would stand without decoration. "Because he knew how to fix it, sir." And the room was getting colder. Whitaker looked away, almost as if the answer had displeased him less than he expected. Hayes buttoned his coat. "That is the only reason I will accept." "Yes, sir." The report was written by noon. It contained no sentiment. It used words like supervised, necessary, temporary, no incident, heat restored. It did not mention the old man resting his hands on the radiator. It did not mention the way the prisoners had sat in silence while warmth returned. It did not mention Tommy standing in the doorway with rain on his cap and keys heavy in his palm. Official paper had little room for the things that made men remember. That afternoon, Karl was returned to the repair shed as usual. No punishment. No praise. The camp preferred balance. Tommy expected him to work on the box of alarm clocks waiting by the bench, but Karl did not sit at once. He stood near the window where the winter sun had finally broken through, touching the edge of the bench, turning the dust gold. From his coat pocket, he removed the silver watch and placed it between them. The case looked smaller in daylight, less like an object from a legend, more like something a boy might have carried proudly in a vest pocket while walking to school. Tommy looked at it, then at Karl. You were going to repair it? Karl kept his eyes on the stopped hands. No, he opened the lid. The engraved name caught the light. Matthias. Not today. Tommy did not ask why. He had learned by then that some doors could be opened only from the inside. Karl took up an alarm clock and began removing the back. His hands were steady, but his face had changed since the furnace room. Not happier, not lighter, simply less alone in the work. The shed filled with ticking, one clock, then another, each small sound joining the rest until the room seemed to breathe mechanically. Near 4 o'clock, Whitaker came in carrying Tommy's army wristwatch. The leather strap was cracked, and the minute hand had begun slipping whenever the weather turned damp. He set it on the bench as if placing evidence before a judge. Captain says the prisoner may examine this under supervision. Tommy stared at him. My watch. Unless you know another miller who cannot keep time. Whitaker did not smile, but his voice had lost some of its edge. Karl looked from the wristwatch to Tommy. You want this repaired? Tommy hesitated. A week earlier, he would have said it was just government issue. A thing from supply. A tool for standing post and counting hours. Now he imagined his mother glancing at the kitchen clock after supper, wondering where he was in the cold. He imagined Daniel in a hospital overseas, measuring recovery by minutes between letters. He imagined Matthias with the silver watch in his pocket, standing a little straighter because his father had trusted him with time. Tommy unclasped the strap and laid the watch fully on the bench. Yes, he said. Please. Karl nodded once. No grand gesture. No speech. He opened the back carefully and bent toward the small American mechanism with the same patience he gave every broken thing. Tommy stood beside him in the quiet shed while snowmelt dripped from the eaves outside. For the first time, the distance between guard and prisoner did not vanish. It remained. The fence remained. The rules remained. But something had crossed that distance without permission and found a place to stand. Not friendship. Not forgiveness. Something quieter. The recognition that every man carries a clock inside him, and war has a way of stopping it long before the hands are still. The wristwatch was ready before supper. Karl set it on the bench with the strap cleaned, the back sealed, and the minute hand moving in clean obedience around the dial. Tommy lifted it as if it weighed more than it had that morning. It was still the same army watch, plain and scratched, issued from a box like 100 others, but it no longer felt anonymous. A man's hands had gone inside it. A father's patience had touched its smallest parts. Tommy fastened it around his wrist and listened. Tick, tick, tick. A sound so small it could disappear beneath boots, engines, bells, rain, orders, and yet it continued. Karl watched the second hand make one full circle. It will keep time now, he said. Tommy looked at him. Thank you. Karl nodded, then returned to the silver pocket watch lying closed beside the lamp. For a moment, Tommy thought the old man might open it. He did not. Weeks passed. January loosened into February. The cornfields beyond the fence stayed bare, but the snow grew softer at the edges, and crows returned to the fence posts in the late afternoon. Daniel's second telegram came through on a Monday. Stable. Improving. Transferred to a stateside hospital when transport allowed. Tommy read those words under the same office lamp where the first message had emptied the air from his chest. This time, Captain Hayes allowed himself one small nod before returning to paperwork. That evening, Tommy stood at the repair shed door and told Karl. The old man listened with both hands resting on the bench. Good, he said. Only that. But he said it like a prayer spoken by someone who no longer trusted churches to do all the praying. In March, lists began appearing on the bulletin board outside the administration building. Transfers, labor assignments, medical reviews. Men gathered near them with careful faces, trying not to show how much a typed name could change the weight of a day. Karl's name appeared on a Thursday morning. Repatriation processing. Departure pending. He read it once, then stepped away so the next man could look. Tommy saw him later in the shed, sitting very still beneath the dusty window. The silver pocket watch lay open before him. The back had been removed. Tiny pieces rested on a cloth in perfect order. The cracked glass was beside them. Karl worked slowly, not because the repair was difficult, but because each movement asked permission from a memory. He cleaned the balance wheel. He replaced the bent staff with one shaped from a broken camp clock. He polished the jewel. He adjusted the spring. Tommy did not speak. Outside, snowmelt ran from the eaves in steady drops. Inside, the shed held its breath. Near dusk, Karl closed the case and wound the crown 3 careful turns. At first, nothing happened. Then the watch began to tick. Karl shut his eyes. His hand closed around the case. He did not cry. He did not smile. He simply sat there while time, after all those months, moved again. The day Karl left, the sky was washed clean and pale over Iowa. Prisoners stood with bags at their feet. Guards checked papers. A bus waited beyond the gate, its engine coughing white smoke into the morning. Tommy stood beside Whitaker near the yard. The sergeant had said very little that week. Just before the line moved, Karl stepped out of formation with permission from Captain Hayes. He walked to Tommy and placed the silver pocket watch in his hand. Tommy immediately tried to give it back. "I cannot take this." Karl covered Tommy's fingers with his own and closed them around the case. "My son cannot carry it," he said. "You can." Tommy looked down at the engraved name inside the lid. Matthias. The watch ticked against his palm. Steady and alive. Karl's voice lowered. "Do not keep it because of me. Keep it because time must belong to the living." There was no embrace. The camp would not have known what to do with that. Karl only rested one hand on Tommy's shoulder for a single second, light as a blessing, then stepped back into line. The bus pulled away through the gate and onto the muddy county road, growing smaller between the empty fields until it became only sound, then dust, then nothing at all. Years later, in a small town in Iowa, Thomas Miller opened a watch repair shop with a green door and brass letters painted on the window. On the wall above his bench hung his old army wristwatch, still running. In the top drawer, wrapped in a clean cloth, lay the silver pocket watch with the German name inside. Customers came in with broken clocks, stopped watches, bent springs, cracked glass. Thomas repaired them carefully. He never forced a gear. He never blamed the spring until he checked the dust. And when a young father brought in a child's first watch, Thomas handled it with both hands, because he knew by then that time was never only time. The war had given him orders, fences, and rules. One quiet prisoner had given him a standard. He had not raised his voice. He had simply kept something human running.